21 nights. Same question, same moment right before sleep. No candles, no crystals, no elaborate ritual setup. Just me, a dark room, and one sentence I whispered into the silence before my eyes closed. I didn't expect anything to happen. That's the honest version. I wasn't in some desperate spiritual crisis. I wasn't following a guru's 30-day program, and I wasn't trying to manufacture content for a video. I genuinely just wanted to know, what would happen if you held a single, specific question in your mind with total consistency, night after night, for 3 full weeks? The answer surprised me. Not because something dramatic exploded into my life on day 7, but because what unfolded was so quiet, so incremental, and so undeniably structured that I couldn't ignore it. And when I went looking for a framework that explained what I'd experienced, not a metaphor, not a motivational interpretation, but an actual structural explanation, I found it in the oldest esoteric tradition most people have never seriously studied. What I found completely changed how I understand the relationship between a focused mind, time, and reality. This is going to take a while to explain properly, so stay with me. Let me be specific about what I actually did, because the mechanics matter more than most people realize. Every night, for 21 consecutive nights, right at the threshold of sleep, that drowsy, half-dissolved state where the analytical mind starts losing its grip, I asked a single question, the same one, word for word. I'm not going to tell you what the question was, not because it's too personal to share, but because the specific content of the question is almost irrelevant to what I'm about to explain. What mattered was the structure of the practice. One question, repeated with precision at the same moment every night without deviation. Why 21 nights specifically? The number didn't come from a self-help book. It came from something much older. In Hermetic philosophy, the ancient system of thought attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which quietly underlies everything from Neoplatonism to the Kabbalah to modern depth psychology, there is a foundational understanding that meaningful change requires sustained cycles of directed intention. Not a single burst of effort, not willpower applied once and then released, but a rhythm, a pattern held long enough to become a structural reality rather than a passing thought. 3 weeks is approximately 3 lunar phase cycles, and before you tune out, I'm not about to tell you to dance in a field. The lunar connection here is functional, not mystical. Ancient observers understood that the moon's cycle, roughly 28 days, with 21 marking the completion of 3 full quarter phases, tracks something real about how long concentrated attention needed to be maintained before it began producing externally visible results. The practice wasn't moon worship. It was precision timing based on centuries of observation. But there's a more immediate reason the 21-night frame matters. Psychologists who study habit formation have noted that behavioral changes require somewhere between 18 and 66 days of consistent repetition before they become self-sustaining, with 21 days often cited as an early inflection point, the moment where the behavior stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like a default. What Hermetic practitioners understood intuitively, and what behavioral science eventually confirmed, is that the human mind has a threshold. Below that threshold, a new pattern of thought is fragile, easily disrupted, reversible. Above it, the pattern has weight. It influences perception automatically, without requiring you to consciously invoke it every single time. So the question I was asking wasn't just a nightly thought experiment. It was a seed being planted with enough repetition that it restructured the soil. The first few nights, nothing notable. I asked the question, drifted to sleep, woke up, and went about my day. No visions, no sudden insights, no dramatic moments. This is important to say because I think most people abandon practices like this precisely here, in the unremarkable early phase, mistaking the absence of fireworks for the absence of effect. By the end of the first week, something subtle had shifted. I started noticing things during the day that seemed loosely relevant to the question I'd been asking at night. A conversation, a line in an article, a memory that surfaced for no obvious reason. Each instance felt too minor to declare meaningful, but they were accumulating. I actually started keeping a small notebook on my bedside table. Nothing formal, just quick notes, 3 or 4 words, capturing whatever had floated through my awareness that day that seemed related. By day 14, when I flipped back through the entries, the pattern was undeniable. Not in some abstract connect-the-dots way. The entries were literally converging on a single theme I had never consciously articulated. The question I was asking at night was reshaping what I noticed during the day. And what I noticed during the day was feeding back into the question at night. A loop had started. That loop has a name in Hermetic philosophy, and understanding it changes everything about how you think about the relationship between intention and experience. I'm Daniel, and if you've been watching Hermetic Talk for a while, you already know that most popular coverage of Hermetic philosophy focuses on the 7 Hermetic principles: as above, so below, the principle of vibration, polarity, rhythm, and so on. These get quoted constantly. They show up on Instagram slides and in self-help books with titles about quantum energy and manifestation. That's not what we're doing here. What I want to talk about is something that sits underneath those principles, a structural assumption that the entire Hermetic worldview depends on, but that almost no one spells out clearly because it sounds too simple to be profound. Before we continue, there's something I want to place in your hands. We've gathered 12 years of Hermetic source material, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Emerald Tablets, and more, stripped of fear bait and rebuilt as a working initiatory sequence into a single 3-volume library for those who feel the pull towards something deeper. Because whether we speak of clearing the field of what was never yours, architecting reality through the 7 Hermetic laws as machinery, or building an auric field with weight that walks into a room ahead of you, one truth remains. Understanding without sequence leaves the ground unowned and nothing moves. This is for anyone who's ready to work the initiation in the order it was always meant to be worked. You'll find it in the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code right here. I'll give you a moment to do that. Here it is. Mind and matter are not 2 separate categories. They are 2 expressions of the same thing operating at different densities. The Corpus Hermeticum, the collection of Greek texts from roughly the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE that form the philosophical core of the Hermetic tradition, makes this explicit in multiple places. The universe is mental in its fundamental nature. Not mental in the pop spiritual sense of you just need to think positively. Mental in the strict sense that consciousness is not produced by matter. Matter is a condensed expression of consciousness. The mind doesn't interact with reality from the outside. The mind is what reality is made of, operating at a particular frequency and density. Now, and this is where it gets interesting, if that framework is true, even provisionally, then the relationship between sustained thought and physical experience isn't metaphorical. It's literal. A mind holding a consistent pattern of attention is not just influencing its perception of reality, it is, according to Hermetic metaphysics, participating in the construction of the reality it will encounter. This is the idea that the 2nd century philosopher Plotinus, who drew heavily from Hermetic and Platonic sources, tried to articulate when he wrote about how the soul doesn't merely observe the world, but actively shapes it through the quality of its attention. The soul emanates. It doesn't just receive. But here's where the Hermetic tradition diverges sharply from how this idea usually gets presented in modern spiritual content. The tradition was not optimistic about undisciplined minds. The Kybalion, a 20th century synthesis of Hermetic principles, published in 1908, attributed to the mysterious 3 initiates, makes a distinction that most people completely gloss over. There's a difference between mental transmission that is intentional, directed, and sustained, and mental transmission that is random, reactive, and inconsistent. The first type, the tradition argues, has cumulative structural power. The second type largely cancels itself out. Random noise doesn't build architecture. This is why the 21-night practice worked the way it did, and why a single night of asking a question, or even a week of it, produces so little. The Hermetic model isn't about the intensity of a single thought. It's about the structural coherence of thought over time. One question, held with precision, night after night, begins to function not as a passing mental event, but as a standing frequency, a persistent signal that reorganizes what your mind treats as relevant, significant, and worth attending to. I personally think this is the most underrated concept in the entire Hermetic system, not the dramatic metaphysics of vibration or polarity, but this quiet, almost mechanical idea that the mind functions less like a spotlight and more like a radio tower, and that sustained, coherent signal has cumulative effects on the structure of experienced reality. The question isn't whether you believe that literally. The question is whether the model produces results when you apply it seriously. And that's a question you can test. I want to describe something that took me years to recognize and even longer to take seriously. There is a specific moment, not a metaphor, an actual phenomenological moment that occurs somewhere between full wakefulness and sleep onset. Neuroscientists call it the hypnagogic state. The brain's electrical activity shifts from the fast, tightly organized beta waves of alert cognition toward the slower, looser alpha and theta rhythms associated with deep relaxation and early sleep. In that window, the critical, analytical, filtering functions of the prefrontal cortex begin to disengage. And that is precisely when the question lands differently. Here's what I mean. During waking hours, when you ask yourself a significant question, the rational mind immediately activates its filing system. It cross-references the question against existing beliefs, dismisses possibilities that contradict current frameworks, generates objections, and generally does everything it can to route the question back to a conclusion you've already reached. The mind at full wakefulness is a very effective conservator of its existing architecture. At the hypnagogic threshold, that conserving function softens. The question you ask doesn't hit the same wall of pre-existing conclusions. It goes somewhere else, somewhere quieter, and, according to the Hermetic framework, somewhere deeper in the hierarchy of mind. The Hermetica, and later the Renaissance Hermetic tradition, as developed by figures like Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, placed significant weight on what we might call liminal states of consciousness. The idea wasn't that you became more psychic at the threshold of sleep. The idea was that the usual interference between the surface mind and the deeper structural layers of consciousness was temporarily reduced. Information that was available at a deeper level, patterns, connections, structural relationships, became accessible in ways that full waking cognition normally blocked. Ficino, writing in 15th century Florence, called this the condition for true philosophical inspiration. He wasn't being romantic, he meant it practically. The mind in a liminal state is less defended, more permeable, and therefore more capable of receiving what he called impressions from deeper orders of reality. I spent a while being skeptical of this framing. Then I started paying attention to what actually happened in the hypnagogic window during those 21 nights, and the skepticism became harder to maintain. Night after night, right at that threshold, the question I'd been asking began generating what I can only describe as structural responses. Not voices, not visions, more like the sudden arrival of a fully formed perspective or connection that I hadn't consciously assembled. The kind of clarity that doesn't feel constructed, it feels received. I had a similar experience a few years back when I was working through some research for our earlier video on the Emerald Tablet, the one titled The Emerald Tablet Decoded. I remember lying in bed one night after spending hours with the text, completely stuck on the meaning of one particular line, and then waking up at 3 a.m. with a coherent interpretation that I hadn't consciously worked out. I dismissed it at the time as coincidence. Looking back, it wasn't. It was the same mechanism: sustained, focused engagement with a problem, planted at the hypnagogic threshold, processed below the surface, and returned in a more complete form. The Hermetic tradition calls this the difference between discursive reason, the kind of thinking that works step by step, argument by argument, and what it calls nous, which is typically translated as divine intellect, but which functionally refers to a mode of knowing that is immediate, holistic, and not assembled from parts. Discursive reason is how you figure out your tax return. Nous is how you understand, all at once, what a decade of your life actually meant. The hypnagogic window doesn't give you access to nous because it's magical. It gives you access because it temporarily removes the cognitive machinery that normally prevents you from operating at that level. The question you plant there isn't intercepted by your belief system before it can do its work. It goes in whole. So let me tell you what this actually looked like in practice, because I think there's a version of this story that sounds like a spiritual retreat: candles, silence, a notepad on a bamboo nightstand. That's not what happened. I was doing this in the middle of an ordinary life. Work in the morning, obligations in the afternoon, the usual low-grade mental noise of existing in the world. The only thing that changed was what I did in the last 60 seconds before I let myself fall asleep. The question I chose wasn't dramatic. I didn't ask for a sign from the cosmos or demand to know my purpose in some grand cinematic sense. I asked something specific. I had been sitting with a decision for months, one of those situations where both paths forward seemed reasonable and neither felt right. And I wanted to understand what I actually valued underneath the surface logic I kept constructing. The question I planted, night after night, was simple. What do I actually want here, beneath what I think I should want? The first few nights produced nothing I could hold on to. I'd feel a kind of loosening at the edge of sleep, and then I'd be gone. Whatever happened in that corridor between waking and dreaming didn't leave a residue I could retrieve in the morning. I started keeping a voice recorder on my phone, unlocked, volume down, so I could murmur into it without really waking myself up. That changed things. Not because I suddenly started receiving transmissions from some deeper intelligence, but because the act of recording gave the hypnagogic material somewhere to go. It created a small pressure, a reason for that liminal space to produce something expressible. By night 4 or 5, something shifted. Not in a way that felt significant in the moment, it felt almost mundane. I'd be drifting, and an image would arrive. Not a dream image exactly, more like a still frame, a particular object, a face, a texture, a spatial arrangement that I recognized but couldn't immediately place. And underneath or alongside those images, sometimes words, not sentences I was constructing, more like phrases that appeared already assembled, the way you sometimes remember a lyric you haven't thought about in 15 years. It arrives complete without retrieval effort. Before we continue, some of what I've learned simply never makes it onto YouTube. That's why we have Insights Academy, a free newsletter where I go deeper into hidden knowledge, ancient wisdom, metaphysics, and the nature of consciousness, the knowledge we don't share in these videos. And when you sign up, you'll receive the Kybalion as a welcome gift. You'll find it through the link in the description below or by scanning the QR code on your screen. I'll give you a moment to do that. I'd murmur whatever I caught into the recorder and fall asleep. In the morning, I'd play it back. Some of it was noise, fragments of the day's residue, half-formed nonsense that meant nothing when examined in daylight. But some of it stopped me. There were mornings when I'd hear something I'd recorded at 11 p.m. and feel the specific discomfort of being seen accurately. Not told something I didn't know in some abstract sense, but shown something I knew and had been routing around. That's a different experience. That's not new information. That's old information that had been kept out of the room. This is actually the distinction I find most interesting about the whole process, and I'll come back to this idea in more depth, but the hypnagogic state doesn't seem to generate wisdom from nowhere. What it seems to do is surface wisdom that was already present but functionally inaccessible. The cognitive architecture we run during the day is extraordinarily good at many things, but one of the things it's quietly excellent at is protecting us from conclusions we don't yet want to reach. The pre-sleep window, for reasons that are partially neurological and partially just structural, you're horizontal, you're tired, your defenses cost more to maintain than they're worth at that point. That window seems to lower the cost of honesty. I'm Daniel, and on this channel, Hermetic Talk, we've circled around this territory from a lot of different angles. The mechanics of altered states, the philosophy of inner knowing, the question of what ancient traditions were actually pointing at when they described oracular experience. But this experiment, these 21 nights, felt different from the research. It felt like the difference between reading about swimming and being in the water. And what the water felt like, once I got past the first few nights of adjustment, was not mystical. It felt like a very quiet form of pressure. The question I had planted didn't announce itself each night. I wasn't lying there consciously repeating it like a mantra, but something held it. Some organizing principle in the system kept returning to it. The images and phrases that surfaced, when I examined them over the full 21 days, weren't random. They were orbiting something. They were variations on a theme I hadn't consciously chosen to keep returning to. The question had been absorbed and was working on its own time. Here's the thing that started to bother me around day 10. Not bother in a negative sense, bother in the sense of a splinter you keep noticing. The phenomenon I was experiencing wasn't new. It wasn't even slightly new. The more I sat with what was happening during those 21 nights, the more I kept running into the same realization. I was essentially participating in a practice that had been documented, named, and systematically developed across multiple civilizations thousands of years before anyone had a word for neuroscience. The ancient Greeks had a formal practice called incubation. This wasn't metaphorical. It was a structured, institutionalized ritual in which a person seeking guidance would travel to a sacred site, most famously the sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus, undergo a period of preparation involving fasting, purification, and ritual, and then sleep within the temple precinct, specifically to receive information through dreams or the threshold states immediately surrounding them. The word incubation comes from the Latin incubare, meaning to lie upon. You lay yourself down, deliberately, as a posture of receptivity. The temple priests didn't tell you what you'd receive. You went in with a question, and you lay down with it. The Greeks weren't the only ones. The ancient Egyptians used what they called dream temples, some attached to the Temple of Serapis, for similar purposes, directed inquiry through sleep, with trained interpreters available to help process what was retrieved. In Mesopotamia, there are cuneiform records describing rituals specifically designed to invite significant dreams. The Hebrew tradition has its own version in the practice of Shi'alat Chalom, dream questioning, in which a specific form of preparation was undertaken before sleep with the intention of receiving insight on a particular problem. Different cultures, different theological frameworks, wildly different cosmologies, and the same functional core. Ask the question before you cross the threshold, and pay careful attention to what comes back. Now, the rationalizing move here is to say that all of these practices were simply pre-scientific cultures doing their best to explain psychological phenomena they didn't have the vocabulary to describe accurately. And there's something to that. But I think that framing quietly discards something important. These weren't uneducated people fumbling toward an explanation. The priests of Epidaurus, the Egyptian dream interpreters, the rabbinical scholars who codified Shi'alat Halom, these were sophisticated thinkers operating within developed intellectual traditions. When they described what happened in the threshold space before sleep, They weren't guessing, they were recording. The interpretation varied by tradition, but the phenomenon they were recording was consistent. What they consistently recorded was this: the question you hold at the edge of sleep is processed differently than the question you think about during the day. It goes somewhere, and what comes back, not always, not mechanically, but with enough regularity to be worth systematizing, is not what you would have produced by thinking harder. It has a different texture, a different kind of authority. I spent an entire afternoon, this was maybe day 12 of the experiment, going through the Hermetic literature more carefully than I had before, specifically looking at the passages that deal with the mechanics of inner knowing rather than the metaphysical cosmology. And what I kept finding, underneath the elaborate symbolic architecture of those texts, was a remarkably clear-eyed account of something that functions exactly like what happens in the hypnagogic state. The Hermetica distinguishes, repeatedly and in multiple formulations, between knowledge that is constructed through reasoning and knowledge that arrives whole. The second kind is described not as inferior or merely emotional, but as a higher mode, not irrational, but supra-rational, which is a distinction that gets lost when people read these texts through a modern lens that can only categorize things as either logical or not. The practical implication is this: if you believe the Hermetic framework, or if you simply take seriously the convergent testimony of multiple sophisticated ancient traditions, then the hypnagogic state isn't an accident of neurology that happens to sometimes produce useful material. It's a window. A recurring, nightly, universally available window that most people never deliberately use because no one taught them to. And once you see it that way, the 21-night practice stops feeling like an experiment and starts feeling like something closer to basic literacy. Not mysticism, literacy. The skill of reading something that was always there, in a language you were simply never taught. Let me be precise about something, because I think imprecision here does real damage to the credibility of everything I've been describing. When I say the practice produced answers, I don't mean I heard a voice. I don't mean I received a clear directive that resolved my question, like a decision handed down from a boardroom. The answers don't look like that, and honestly, I think the expectation that they should look like that, the expectation of clarity, of certainty, of a message you couldn't possibly misinterpret, is exactly what causes people to try this kind of practice and then dismiss it as having produced nothing. What the answers actually look like is much stranger and much more interesting. They look like a recurring image that makes no logical sense until the 8th time you see it, and then suddenly the logic is obvious and you can't understand how it wasn't obvious before. They look like a phrase that surfaces in that pre-sleep window, 3 nights in a row, that you initially interpret one way, and then on the 4th morning, you hear your own recording and you realize you've been mishearing it, and what you actually said was slightly different, and that slight difference changes everything. They look like an emotional tone that persists across multiple nights, underneath different imagery, and when you finally name the tone, when you find the word for it, you recognize it as the emotional signature of a truth you've been avoiding. They rarely arrive as propositions. They arrive as orientations, as a felt sense of direction, as a quality of pull towards something you might not be able to articulate immediately, but that you can navigate by. This is actually one of the key features of the nous-type knowing the Hermetic tradition describes. It isn't primarily propositional. It doesn't say, this is true, in the way a logical argument does. It says, this is the shape of things. And that shape, once you perceive it, reorganizes how all the other pieces fit together. Around night 15, I had an experience that I've been trying to figure out how to describe accurately ever since, because every way I find to say it sounds either more dramatic or less significant than it actually was. I'd been asking my question for 2 weeks. The images had been accumulating in my recordings, and at some point during that night, not in a dream, not in full waking consciousness, but in that corridor, something resolved. That's the only word I have. It resolved. like a chord that had been slightly detuned suddenly coming into tune. I didn't receive new information. I didn't hear anything I hadn't technically known somewhere in myself. But the information I already had rearranged itself into a configuration that I could see clearly. What I wanted. What I had been pretending I didn't want, because wanting it felt dangerous or premature or unreasonably optimistic. It was simply there, suddenly organized, in a way that felt, and this is the part that's hard to convey without sounding like I'm overclaiming, settled. Not certain, settled. There's a difference. Certainty is a position you defend. Settlement is a place you can rest. The following days had a different quality. Not euphoric, nothing as loud as euphoria. More like the cognitive load of carrying an unresolved question, which I hadn't even fully noticed until it was gone, had simply been lifted. I was making decisions from a different position. Not from the position of someone trying to figure out what they want, from the position of someone who knows and is now just deciding how. I want to be careful here not to oversell this. The practice doesn't resolve everything. It doesn't give you a roadmap. There are questions I've brought to the hypnagogic window since those 21 nights that have returned nothing useful, or nothing I could retrieve with enough fidelity to work with. There are nights when the window closes fast and I'm just asleep. The process is not reliable in the way a calculator is reliable. It's reliable in the way that a very honest friend is reliable. Not always available, not always comfortable, not always telling you what you hope to hear, but when it speaks, you've learned to listen. By night 21, the experiment had ended, but the practice hadn't. That's the thing I didn't fully anticipate going in. I assumed I'd complete the 21 nights, draw some conclusions, and return to my regular relationship with falling asleep, which had been, like most people's, essentially passive. You lie down, you wait, consciousness recedes. You try not to think too hard about the things you forgot to do, fail at that, eventually drift off. The threshold was something you passed through on the way to somewhere else. You didn't stop in it. You certainly didn't work in it. What changed after 21 nights was that I couldn't unsee the window. Once you've established the habit of arriving at that edge of sleep with intention, the absence of intention feels like waste. It feels, and I recognize this might sound dramatic, like leaving a tool unused that's been sitting in your house your entire life. Every night. Available. And you walked past it every single time because you didn't know what it was. The deeper question this experiment raised for me wasn't about the 21 nights specifically. It was about the nature of inquiry itself. What we've inherited from the modern educational framework is a model of inquiry that is almost entirely daylight. You gather information, you reason about it, you test hypotheses, you revise. All of this happens in full waking consciousness, under conditions of social accountability, within structures of language and logic that are extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily constraining in equal measure. The framework is magnificent at certain things. It built the infrastructure of the modern world. But it is structurally incapable of accessing certain categories of knowing, not because those categories are supernatural, but because the tools it uses are wrong for the job. Trying to use discursive reason to access the kind of knowing the Hermetic tradition calls nous is like trying to see the stars by turning on more lights. The lights aren't the problem. They're very good lights, but more light is not the solution to the problem of seeing something that requires darkness. I personally think this is the most consistently underestimated idea in the entire body of esoteric literature. Not the cosmological claims, not the metaphysics, but this simple, practical, neurologically plausible idea that inquiry has a nocturnal dimension, and that we have spent centuries culturally insisting on conducting the whole of our inner life in the daytime. The cost of that, in terms of unresolved questions that could have been resolved, unmade decisions that could have been made, clarity that was available but never retrieved. I don't think we have the tools to measure what we've lost, but I think it's significant. The Hermetic texts aren't the only place this shows up. Across traditions and continents, there is a remarkably consistent piece of testimony. that knowledge of a particular kind comes not from accumulation, but from stillness at the right moment, in the right posture, with the right question already held. The specific vocabulary varies enormously. The cosmological framework around the practice varies enormously, but the practice itself, ask, release, receive, attend, appears again and again, recognized independently, as if each tradition rediscovered it on its own and found it reliable enough to codify and preserve. That kind of convergence is itself a form of evidence. Not proof, evidence. The distinction matters. We're not in a domain where proof is possible in the scientific sense, and anyone claiming otherwise is selling something. But convergent testimony across independent traditions, across centuries, about a specific, repeatable, teachable practice, that's something worth taking seriously. That's worth 21 nights. If you're sitting with something you can't resolve, not for lack of information, but because the answer seems to be somewhere you don't know how to look, this is where I'd point you. Not to a guru, not to a system, not to a course, to your own threshold. To the window that opens every night without exception in the last moments before you go. Plant the question there. Keep a way to record what comes back. Do it with enough consistency to get past the noise of the first few nights. And then pay attention. Not with analysis at first, but with the same quality of attention you'd bring to something you're trying to hear clearly in a loud room. Quiet, patient, leaning in. The universe, or your deeper mind, or the nous, or whatever name sits most comfortably in your particular framework, doesn't require you to believe in it before it will answer. It only requires you to ask, and to ask with enough seriousness that you actually wait for the response instead of supplying one yourself. 21 nights, one question. That's the whole practice. What you get back is yours to interpret. But in my experience, and after 21 consecutive nights of doing this with more intentionality than I'd ever brought to anything called the spiritual practice, what you get back is usually more honest than anything you'd have constructed on your own in the daylight. It comes from somewhere underneath the version of you that knows how to be strategic about self-knowledge. And that place, whatever you call it, has been trying to be heard for a long time.